All right, everyone, and we are live.
Thank you, and thank all of you for joining us today for OEC Statehouse briefing. I'm Trent Doherty, OEC General Counsel, and this is my 16th year at OEC, and have been dealing with the folks at the Statehouse for a very long time. Thankfully, things are getting back to normal after a 2020 where things were far from normal. We're living with this new normal, at least new normal process we have here, coming into your living rooms or offices via Zoom. But as we'll talk about in the next 40 minutes or so, the Statehouse doesn't have a new normal. It is the old normal, and especially as it pertains to the environment. Their old ways of introducing bills, introducing amendments, usually in the dark of night or in the 11th hour, to really provide some negative impacts to the air we breathe, the water we drink, and our democracy. And so we're going to cover for the next 40 minutes or so really what has been going on here at this 134th General Assembly. And I'm so glad to have with me my teammates in that effort. OEC's Vice President of Energy Policy, Randy Lepla, OEC's Managing Director of Water Policy, Pete Booker, and OEC's Public Lands Director, Nathan Johnson. And before I let them go into a little bit of what we've seen at the Statehouse over the past 5 months or so, just to give you a bit of a high level of where the Statehouse is in terms of its process. So we started the 134th General Assembly off in January of this year. The focus of power really is in Lima, Ohio. The Speaker of the House, Bob Cupp, and the Senate President, Matt Huffman, are from the Lima-Allen County area. So that's sort of where the center of power is, as those are the decision makers as we move forward. And the General Assembly has one main thing to do, and that's to pass their operating budget for the next 2 years. And we'll go into some detail as that thousands of page document dealing with $75 billion worth of taxpayers' funds, federal funds, fines and fees go into protecting everything that we hold dear, as well as everything that moves the General Assembly. Sorry, everything that moves the state government. But let me just also set the stage here, and I'll give you a snapshot of where we're going to move this. So everything is not necessarily from the state budget, but really the budget bill is the focus of the General Assembly right now. They need to get that bill passed and on the governor's desk by midnight on July 1st. And right now it is in the conference committee. So all of the public side of the state budget bill, House Bill 110, is over and done. And it's now back and forth between the House and Senate when it comes to what version of the budget are they going to present to the governor. And we'll go in, there's impacts to energy, there's impacts to water, there's impacts to public lands, and impacts to our environment. And it's really important just to get present that it is not just on OEC and our staff that are key in this battle, but our partners and our members, just like you, are all part of this process. But to dig in a little bit deeper, what the Statehouse is up to, I'm going to start with our VP of Energy Policy, Randy Lepla, to tell you all of the things that's happening on energy.
Great, thanks, Trent. We're going to start with the most concerning first. I think I would have to say, and my counterparts in land and water would probably agree. So I'm Randy Lepla, I'm our VP of Energy Policy, and so I'm going to cover a lot of things that are going on at the Statehouse right now on energy. And unfortunately, a lot of these things are things that have happened that will really stunt the growth of renewables in the state. I think, as a lot of folks on here probably know, last General Assembly, we spent most of our time in the energy world revolved around repealing House Bill 6, or at least attempting to repeal pieces of it. And this General Assembly, we're continuing to push for a full repeal while fending off additional attacks on clean energy. But there are a few bright spots, so I will get to those too. But unfortunately, some of those bright spots really kind of pale in comparison to the damage some of these bills are likely to do to our clean energy future in the state. So there are kind of several groups of bills right now. The first are those House Bill 6 related bills. The second group are kind of anti-renewables, but pro-fossil fuel bills. And then a group of bills that are actually moving us in the right direction. So first, the House Bill 6 bills. There are clean and full repeal bills that have been introduced at the beginning of the General Assembly and pending, but the General Assembly decided to take this up kind of piecemeal instead. They passed House Bill 128, or what I call the First Energy Goodies Bill. It repealed the nuclear subsidies, a decoupling mechanism that gave a windfall to First Energy, and then what's called the significantly excessive earnings test that allowed First Energy to really pool its resources between its affiliated companies and get another kind of windfall. So this still leaves us, those are the only pieces that were repealed out of the whole House Bill 6 debacle. So this still leaves Ohioans paying for extended subsidies for 2 coal-fired power plants, one of which is in Indiana through 2030, as well as leaving our clean energy standards repealed. And that includes our energy efficiency standards that helped Ohioans all over the state reduce their energy consumption and save money and get us cleaner air. And also our renewable portfolio standard, which was reduced from 12.5 to 8.5 and terminates in 2026. So we continue to fight to get those, the clean energy standards reinstated and to especially repeal those OVEC subsidies, which are going to artificially prop up dirty coal plants for the next almost decade. So aside positive note related to all of this, the House did move to expel now former Representative Householder last week by a vote of 75 to 21. So kind of looking like they're trying to clean up some of their own mess related to the House Bill 6 corruption scandal. And there's lots more going on related to that, but that's the most of it at the State House. The second group of bills is comprised of new and expanded attacks on clean energy while propping up fossil fuels. Starting with Senate Bill 52 and House Bill 118. These 2 bills are kind of why I say new and expanded. We saw a very similar bill last General Assembly. It was House Bill 401 that would have permitted townships to hold referendum on wind farms, basically making it impossible for a developer to cite a wind project because it could have been rejected kind of after a developer had sunk millions of dollars into it. Those original versions of Senate Bill 52 and 118 permitted that township level to block wind, but then these 2 bills expanded this General Assembly to also block utility scale solar. So these really single out renewables as the only form of generation in the state, subject to both a statewide process at the Ohio Power Siting Board and then local regulation as well. Both of those bills were amended since the original versions, and Senate Bill 52 was actually voted out of the Senate and is now moving forward in the House. I testified on that bill yesterday when a sub-bill was accepted. So this new bill creates kind of 2 mechanisms that really perpetuate this unlevel playing field for renewables in the state. So the first is that counties can now reject or ban, if this passes, to be clear, counties could reject or ban any and all large wind and solar development in their entire county or limit it to just a ban in parts of their county. And then the second thing they can do, they can either reject or limit the scope of specific large wind and solar projects. So both of these, like I said, are in addition to the already existing requirements at the state level through the Ohio Power Siting Board, and no other form of generation or energy infrastructure like pipelines are required to go through this type of approval process at the Power Siting Board. The thing that's really frustrating, there's another component of this bill that would also add a county commissioner and a township trustee or their designees on as ad hoc members of the Ohio Power Siting Board. And that's, again, the body that approves or denies certificates. And that would be limited. That's good. You're going to have some representation at the local level on the Power Siting Board as decision makers. But again, the bill is limiting that to just wind and solar and leaving pipelines out. And we have seen, similar concerns raised from local residents about location, aesthetics, and environmental impacts. So that is, something that we're very strongly opposed to. And we have an action alert out if you're interested in taking action and contacting your representatives. We also have a set of bills that seek to ban local communities from banning or limiting natural gas in their communities. So while we have this anti-renewables and permitting bans, we've actually got a set of bills that would ban communities from banning fossil fuels. So House Bill 201 is the one that's really moving. That would prevent local governments from limiting the use of natural gas. This was amended in the House, I believe, to make sure that aggregated communities that choose to go 100% renewable aren't subject to limitations in the bill. But this bill still sets a terrible precedent. So it was improved slightly, but not great. And we're expecting this to be voted off the Senate floor today. So we do expect that to pass and be signed into law. So like I said, at the same time, Senate Bill 52 is moving forward to allow counties to ban renewables. Members at the legislature are still working to pass legislation like 201 and the other, its companion in the Senate 127, that really protects fossil fuel development in one set of bills and stifles wind and solar in another. But there are some bills pending that would help address some of these barriers. We've got rooftop solar restrictions are being addressed in Senate Bill 61. This is a large bill about HOAs and condo associations, and this would be a great thing if this passes. It would remove arbitrary restrictions that really have nothing to do with installation of rooftop solar and require that they permit that at a reasonable degree. And we really think it strikes a good balance between preserving the character of those planned communities, but enabling residents to make choices about having clean energy on their private property. So really excited about that one. There are several bills pending on electric vehicles right now, House Bill 47 and House Bill 292. Those are moving along through the process, and we're really excited about bills like that because as we shift to clean energy and shift toward clean fuels and electrified options, we really need to see infrastructure build out in an equitable manner so we aren't leaving folks behind. If we try to shift toward electric vehicles and we don't have the proper infrastructure across the state, we're going to end up leaving communities behind. And so as we shift toward that, we really need to have that as a focal point. And so I'm excited about some of the bills moving through the House on those. The final one that we think is a really good bill is Senate Bill 20. This would exempt county utility supply contracts from this arbitrary kind of 10-year maximum period. So basically what this means is that it would remove a barrier that counties face when they're contracting for clean energy. And so that would permit them to make a longer commitment. A lot of times when you're looking to purchase energy generation or do one of these projects, you really need a longer period than 10 years. And so this would enable longer term investments in renewable energy projects for county governments. And the reason that's so important is because we're seeing some really great movement at the local level to shift toward community choice aggregation programs, which is basically bulk buying power. The city of Columbus was one of the most recent ones to approve a ballot measure to go toward aggregation. And so this has usually been used to keep costs low, but now we're seeing cities get creative and use this to actually purchase clean energy. So we're really excited about that as well. And, this is really important in a state like Ohio, where we have these obvious regressive policies that I was talking about before at the state level, but we're seeing lots and lots of great movement toward clean energy on the local level. So that is about a wrap for the State House on clean energy. So I'll turn it back over to Trent.
Thanks, Randy. And yes, it's more than just House Bill 6 and the aftermath that we have to deal with in the State House, but it's good to see that there's lots of activity on our issues. Good to see it on the positive side, and as always, having to fight back on the negative side. We're going to shift over and bring the budget back up. My sort of partner throughout the budget process this year, since it was introduced in February, Pete Booker, will go over a little bit of sort of like what the process is and has been with this budget, and then talk especially about a lot of the water components, not just in the budget, but also around the General Assembly as a whole. But yeah, Pete, do you want to give us a bit of a better overview of the budget process and how we got from introduction in February to where we are now?
Yeah, I'd love to. So in the odd numbered years, as we're in now, the biennial budget bill process for the operating budget for the state government occurs roughly in February, sometimes a little later if there's a new governor. But the process goes where the governor puts a proposal forward in collaboration with his agency and his staff and his team or her team, and that gets introduced in the House to start with. And so the House will then take a budget bill and deliberate it for several months in subcommittees. Then finally, the full Finance Committee will bring back a version or two of changes from whatever a governor has introduced. And then they work to then pass that off to their colleagues in the Senate, who tend to get the bill around May, sometimes later, sometimes earlier, depending on how many issues need to be resolved amongst members and amongst caucuses and amongst chambers. And then roughly from May till June, the Ohio Senate tends to finish things up with a version or two of their own. And then where we currently stand is we are in a conference committee for House Bill 110, which is the current budget bill. And so they've had several meetings to get to this point in conference committee. Currently, the committee is recessed. They have a meeting scheduled for next Tuesday, but they could also reconvene when the chair of the committee decides to do so. So really any moment here in the next week, they could come back together, resolve any final differences, then each chamber will need to concur on those differences to pass a final version of House Bill 110, which, as Trent noted earlier, needs to get to Governor DeWine by June 30th per the Ohio Constitution. Last time there was actually a rare extension, but normally they stick to that June 30th deadline. And so we are really getting down to the final days here, and they can take bits and pieces from any of the versions we've seen so far, as well as new material. And so really vetting through these large documents is crucial to make sure you don't miss a needle in a haystack as far as public policy goes. And so to pivot specifically to some of the water provisions, in general, I think for our work around clean water, it's been a bit of offensive, proactive approaches to try and get good things implemented in the budget bill and otherwise, as well as a good amount of defense to harmful legislation. But I'll start with the budget bill itself. So that is the vehicle for the H2 Ohio program, which is approximately 2 years old. Governor DeWine, in his first version of the budget when he came into office as governor, really championed this fund. And so it's kind of stuck on the 2-year cycle of the operating budget. And so currently the H2 Ohio program provides funding to the Ohio Department of Agriculture to work directly with farmers and do cost sharing for best management practices that deal with nutrient runoff and retention into fields rather than getting into our waterways, and ultimately ending up in Western Lake Erie, where they fuel and help drive the harmful algal blooms that are perennial and that plague the Toledo and greater community in Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan. And so the state currently in the budget proposal, pending any conference committee changes, is looking like the Department of Agriculture will get about $50 million a year for the 2-year biennial budget. In this upcoming iteration, which is a good increase, the agency wants to expand the cost sharing region where they are at. So they started in the 14 counties that surround the Maumee River watershed. If they get their increase, they've signaled they want to increase that geographic scope to the 10 remaining counties in the Western Lake Erie Basin, so just east of the Maumee River. So that will be a very positive expansion of that program if they're able to get it over the finish line. The second of the 3 main pillars for the program is the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. And so they work to implement, restore, create new wetlands throughout the state. Very heavy focus in Northwest Ohio to start, given the problems with Lake Erie, but they do have projects across the state and are aggressively looking to expand to the Ohio River watershed, given that many inland lakes in the Ohio River also have harmful algal bloom problems. And so they look for strategic areas to build and implement these wetlands with on-the-ground partners, whether that be soil and water districts, land trusts, conservation groups, and many others, to get these wetlands in a strategic area and really work on retaining excess nutrients that might be in water bodies to ultimately, again, reduce harmful algal blooms. And the third main pillar for the H2 Ohio program is done through the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency. And so the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency has been working to remove and find lead service lines in schools and daycare facilities right now, just in the Cincinnati area, but potentially expand that going forward. They have a small portion that works to repair and replace home septic systems that may be leaking into a waterway, providing nutrients into the problem that way, as well as other infrastructure grants to communities that might not qualify for the standard state revolving fund water infrastructure grants for one reason or another, to get communities hooked up to better wastewater and drinking water systems that are kind of those next ring out from suburb type communities that might not have as high quality of a water treatment system or drinking water system as they might otherwise through these type of connections. And so right now we're looking at about level funding for this program across the board through the budget bill. The governor did propose about a $70 million increase in his first version back in February, which we were hoping to see be reinstated. But barring a drastic change here in conference committee, it looks like that program will receive level funding going forward, which will be a great foundation. It will build off of the foundation that's been laid to expand its regional impact, be more broadly across the state between these three agencies, and continue working on a number of key watersheds that have problems with water quality. So we're very happy to see this program continue on. And hopefully we can see some sort of long-term solution put in place for funding, rather than just moving from one budget bill to the next, which priorities can drastically change over time as key decision makers may leave their roles, may be term limited. And so one option that is currently introduced in the legislature is Senate Joint Resolution 2, which would use the state's bonding authority to pursue approximately 10 years worth of funding, if approved by a statewide vote for voters, to lock in that fund long term. And so we're really hopeful to continue those discussions with key decision makers to see if we can get that long-term stability for this well-rounded science-based program that is H2 Ohio. So the one item that we have been playing some defense on at the State House of late is House Bill 175. This is a bill that we're seeing similar efforts across the country in various states in the wake of the 2020 rollback to the Clean Water Act at the federal level through the Waters of the United States definition change. And so essentially that took ephemeral streams and isolated wetlands that are not directly attached to the side of a river or a larger water body out of coverage from the Clean Water Act. And so permitting and mitigation fees and fines would no longer be required for those two types of waterways per the federal coverage and regulatory system. Ohio actually remained pretty secure last summer in the wake of those changes. So we did not lose any coverage to our waterways, fortunately. But then this bill, House Bill 175, if passed as it currently stands, would remove ephemeral streams out of state regulatory coverage. And the Ohio EPA estimates we have about 36,000 miles of these ephemeral or rain-dependent streams. And this would be pretty problematic to open up some of our smaller, more vulnerable waterways to pollution, degradation, outright destruction for, say, a development project with no real ramifications. Anything that would be deposited or formed in these waterways inevitably would end up into a larger water system after one or multiple rain events. And about half of Ohioans, or just over half, receive their drinking water from surface water sources. And so we feel this unnecessarily opens up our watersheds to more pollution and degradation. And right now that bill is in a holding pattern. So they were going to do some more deep dive and analysis on it this summer. The House Agriculture and Conservation Committee is where this bill currently sits. So we're hoping to work to delay this bill and get a no vote if it comes to it. But that is what we've been working on with water of late at the State House. So I'll pass it back to you, Trent.
Thanks. And one interesting thing about House Bill 175 is we rarely see the Ohio EPA director oppose a bill publicly. And this bill, the first that I've seen in quite a long time, Director Stevenson has opposed this. What do you think about that, Pete, that their opposition to that?
Yeah, I think it's noteworthy for sure. A lot of agencies, as you said, will kind of just monitor things and not proactively take stances unless it's maybe their budget that's being deliberated in a committee. And I think, you know, from the regulatory community, from the folks at the EPA to other former EPA folks that are very familiar with the regulatory structure for permitting and discharging, really across the board, everyone sees this as a very problematic change that unnecessarily opens up our waterways to pollution. And while we're trying to invest in improvements through H2 Ohio, something like this will just directly undercut those taxpayer dollars that we're putting out into the state to seek improvements. So it doesn't make much sense if we're really trying to achieve water quality improvements.
Thanks. And just to take a step, because I may not have talked about how we're doing questions. What we're going to do is we'll pause after Nathan talks about the public lands portion of what's happening, not just in the budget bill, but throughout the legislation in front of the State House this past few months. We'll pause for a few questions. I see we have one or two right now before we dig into the democracy side of our work and what we see at the General Assembly. But now on to our Public Lands Director, Nathan Johnson. As I said, there's components not just in the budget bill that are good and bad, but other bills that are impacting our public lands. So Nathan, tell us what's happening.
Thanks, Trent. Will do. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I've got three things for you. Two are in the budget bill. One is a separate standalone piece of legislation. And you might see some themes here that kind of carry over from the energy items that Randy was telling us about, and some of the things that Pete was telling us about too. But definitely some really dark storm clouds in the budget this time around. But there are some good, some hopeful things there too. So glad I get to share a little bit of that. So the first thing, and if you've been paying attention to some of our lists and some of the email and information we've been sharing, you've probably seen this, but one of the big problems in the budget bill is the state lands fracking provisions. And this goes back about 10 years. We don't have to get into all the history, but suffice it to say the provisions we're looking at right now, they were introduced in the House version without any testimony, kind of at the last minute. They also appeared again in the Senate version, and they're largely intact. So we're looking to see what happens in conference on this. But basically, we've got several state lands, whether it's state forests, state parks, wildlife areas. All of these under this bill would be opened up to oil and gas leasing. Now that's pretty remarkable. About 10 years ago, something was passed into law that opened up state parks for the first time to oil and gas development. But it did something really interesting. And it's a reflection from that legislation 10 years ago that shows us where we are today. So it took all of the leasing authority out of the individual state agencies, centralized it into a new creation that's called the Oil and Gas Leasing Commission. And that's appointed by the governor, and it's got at least one member of that commission is a member of a statewide environmental organization. The OEC has had representation on that commission in the past. The commission also is required to consider environmental factors, consider recreational factors. When determining, this commission decides whether or not a particular piece of state public land would be eligible to be basically sold, leased out for oil and gas development. The good thing about that, it wasn't good 10 years ago that this was created, but in a sense it was, because the governor at the time, John Kasich, never actually appointed any of the commissioners, never put together any of the rule packages. So long story short, we've effectively been in a freeze for the past 10 years, where yes, there was some legislation, but everything was frozen because this commission wasn't actually functioning, and therefore our state parks have not been drilled, have not been fracked, like a lot of the private lands we've seen in the state. This is the attempt by the industry now to thaw that freeze, to break the ice, so to speak, and really get things moving. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the legislative package. The legislation is looking to change the mission of the state, make it state policy to promote oil and gas development, fracking, leasing on our state parks and state public lands, which is terrible policy. It's the opposite direction that the nation is going federally. So very interesting to be pushing that at this time when we've never been in worse shape in the climate crisis. And, we've never been in a position where I think we've appreciated as a culture, as a society, the importance of our public lands for public health, mental well-being, physical well-being. So it's just a very odd policy choice. But that said, so it's the policy of the state to promote this. It would also take away a level of public oversight, because this commission, at the very least, you do have a member of the public, you have a member of a statewide environmental organization that's at least going to be aware of what's happening. If the state tries to lease out a portion of a state park, that sort of thing, at least in theory, there would be some alarm bells. And certainly once the rules are in place, these would at least go through a process where environmental factors, recreation factors would have to be considered. One of the tricky things this bill does is it takes the commission out of the process. It says, hey, while we're waiting on the rules, which it could take 2 years, it could take 10 years, it could take 20 years for the rules to come out. But while we're waiting on the rules, guess what, agencies? You no longer have to consult with this commission that has members of the public on it. So in theory, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but certainly the law would allow it to happen. The agencies, the state could say, hey, we want to lease out the state park, and the public would have no idea. It could just happen, and we'd basically be cut out of the process, wouldn't have public comment, public notice, public oversight. So that's hugely concerning, especially when it's being paired with the provision that makes it state policy to promote this. So a couple of very concerning things there. And that's a big change. It's a big change from what we've seen over the past 10 years. So we're really angling, we've been advocating to kill this thing, really working on this, hoping we can get it killed in conference, and feeling that we'll certainly be asking for a veto from Governor DeWine. So that's a big one. Now I've got another one. I'm going to jump out of the budget bill, but it's a similar topic, and then I'll hop back in for something good. But this is another bad one. This is a separate standalone bill. This is substitute House Bill 152. This is interesting. This is oil and gas leasing again. This is almost like eminent domain. It's sort of a weird reverse form of eminent domain. It's called unitization or mandatory pooling, forced pooling. If you've been paying attention to fracking, I guess lingo over the past 10 years, it may be something you've heard of, but really it's a way for oil and gas producers to force landowners who don't want to lease their land for whatever reason. It might be economic, it might be environmental, they just don't want fracking on or under their land. This process allows the producers, or 60, if you've got 65% of the landowners all teaming up, you can basically bully the neighbor, the holdout, into basically not being able to resist. They have to agree. The state basically says, okay, companies, go ahead, you're going to do it. There's nothing this landowner can do. So it's forcing you into a lease effectively. That exists. That process exists. It's common. I mean, these statutes, the unitization statutes, they're in all of the states that are major producers, something like half the states in the union. These statutes came into being about 50 years ago, even more. But the catch is these are antiquated. I mean, in Ohio, this was never used for like 50 years, however long it's been on the books. But now you've got these new shale operations as of the past 10 years that are huge. I mean, you've gone from these smaller operations where producers were fighting each other. That's what this was intended to address. But now you've got operations that are leasing out 640 acres minimum. They're getting into the thousands of acres. And really what this has been used for now is, again, it's just forcing that neighbor, whether it's economic, environmental reasons, doesn't want to be part of it. People are getting forced into it. And that's hugely concerning. This bill is looking to make it even easier for the industry to force pool people. We're concerned about that. We're concerned about private landowners, but in terms of a lot of our advocacy, we're focused on public lands. Again, we don't want a state park to be kind of backdoored into leasing through this forced pooled process. So we've been advocating for protections. You know, we've got to exempt the public lands. We also need setbacks, health and safety setbacks. There's a lot of scientific data out there about the air impacts, health impacts. From air pollution, you cannot avoid air pollution from these oil and gas operations. And it's especially critical that we're protecting our children. They're especially vulnerable to lung tissue damage, to endocrine disrupting effects of these toxic air pollutants that are coming out of these operations. And if you look at the literature, you know, some of these impacts can be experienced up to 2 miles away from the wellheads of these things. So we've been advocating for that too. If they're going to open this up and make it basically this process of bullying citizens, something easier for the industry to do, we've got to include protections for lands and people. So just want to let you know that that is another battle we're working on. And then fortunately, it's not all bad. I'll circle back to the budget. There is an effort, and thus far it's in the bill. It's looking really good to protect the Doris Duke Woods. And a little history here. I don't want to take up too much time, but I find it really exciting. This is Malabar Farm State Park up by Mohican and up by Mansfield. This is a really a gem, a historic gem. The famous author Louis Bromfield, probably the most famous author in America, more famous than Ernest Hemingway during the 20s, 30s even, believe it or not. He's from Ohio. He lived in Europe for a long time, but he came back to Ohio. He set up his farm. He grew up in the Mansfield area. His farm is there. Today it's Malabar Farm State Park, but he was one of the founding fathers, so to speak, of the organic farming movement. And so just a tremendous amount of history. I mean, Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, I know that's a little dated now, I suppose, but they were married at his property. And when he died, Doris Duke, the the famous heiress and environmental philanthropist, stepped in and purchased a portion of the property. It's some really nice woods there. So it wouldn't be sold off. And today it's part of the state park, but the bill language that we've been very fortunate to work with some really great local partners. The bill language will officially recognize and designate the woods and protect it in perpetuity from commercial logging. So really excited about that. It's looking really good. I think it's going to happen. So that's something we can celebrate. And I apologize if I've taken up too much time. I do have to hop off. If there's maybe a question or two folks have for me, I can try to answer, and then I can kick it back to you, Trent.
Thanks. Let me check and see whether there were any questions for you, Nathan. Yeah, so the concerns that we have on the budget bill as it pertains to drilling in state parks, as Nathan, as you said, if we had our druthers, we wouldn't be drilling in our parks, period. But at least, you know, when we did lose that battle, there was a process put in place, and our hope is that we can continue to make sure that process is a public process, and to make sure that the public is involved when their land is up for grabs for drilling. I don't see any questions as of yet on this.
It's okay. If
But
folks
let
have
me-
questions, I can email answers too, if that works. Feel free to post them, and I can email you back if I'm not on in a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Nathan. The last pillar of OEC's advocacy is democracy, and it's one of the newer pillars of our advocacy platform. And I know I'll get comments, you know, our government is not a democracy. We know it's a republic, but our power is the democracy. The power behind how we can get things done and how we move is with the people. And that's why we call our efforts here for good government, our democracy plank, and why it's so important that we have a strong democracy, that we have small d democratic institutions that work for us is incredibly important. And it is not just important to have a good government, but it is the reason that we are able to have robust discussions on energy policy, on water policy, on public lands, how we're able to actually make sure that our voices are heard when issues such as do we keep oil and gas out of our parks, or can we as local communities keep oil and gas out of certain communities that don't want it. Those debates are there, as you've heard, and they're happening, and it doesn't happen if we don't make sure that we're able to vote, that our votes count, and that we actually are able as voters to pick our representatives and not the other way around, as we've seen with gerrymandering in the past few years. And that's really how the democracy component of OEC came about. We've worked in good government issues, working with our partners for many years on voting rights issues and democracy work. But it really wasn't until 2018 when we became one of the three organizations working to put in a process in our Constitution to change the way that we draw our maps for our congressional districts. As many people know, and as you look at the district maps, both for Congress as well as for the State House, we are one of the most gerrymandered states in the country, and it's impacted us in a way that, you know, it's why you heard a lot of defense from Pete and from Randy and from Nathan, because we don't always feel that the communities that care about our environment, that care about our public lands, that their voices are heard. So that's why we got involved in redistricting. That's why redistricting is a key component of making sure that we have a clean environment and an environment that we can pass down to future generations. And I mentioned that the number one thing that a General Assembly does, if nothing else, is to pass their budget bill. But every 10 years or so, you get a second important thing, and that is to make sure that those districts are drawn and drawn in a way that truly represent the people and the communities in Ohio and have their voices heard. And as I've said, to make sure that they pick their representatives and not the representatives pick which part of the state they want to represent. Unfortunately, the process that was put in place that we got passed in 2018 and in 2015 has not been able to work perfectly despite all of our efforts, mainly because the pandemic put the census on a bit of a hold, and it's taking the Census Bureau a long time to get those numbers to the state so that we know where we can start drawing those districts. However, that hasn't stopped us from making sure that the folks at the State House know that we want a public process and that we want to make sure that the public is involved. So we've been doing some work at that sort of proactive level, working with leadership in both the House and Senate to make sure that a process is put in place this fall, that we have a transparent redistricting process, not a process as 10 years ago and the 10 years before that, where our districts were drawn in a bunker in a hotel room away from the public eye. So hopefully keep up with OEC and you'll learn more about your ability to be involved in that, both at the public level with the General Assembly, but also how you can have conversations with your own community. A couple of bills, though, that are rolling around the General Assembly that really have an impact to our democracy in a negative way are House Bills 285 and House Bill 294. I'll start with 294. That is a bill that's aimed at how we vote, how our elections run, and we feel that it is a bad bill that can only move us in the wrong direction when it comes to making sure that every eligible Ohio voter is able to cast their ballot and make sure that their ballot counts. We thought we had learned quite a bit over the past year, where we were able to have an election, a presidential election in this state and throughout the country, that through a pandemic that really made us focus on, how do we make it easier? How do we make it safer to not only cast our ballot, but make sure that ballot is counted. Unfortunately, we see in House Bill 294 provisions that eliminate the use of drop boxes that we utilized quite a bit in both the primary and the general election in 2020, and helped create what we see as the record-breaking number of voters that cast their ballots in Ohio. They utilize those drop boxes. This eliminates the use of drop boxes, drastically limits the use of those drop boxes to just 10 days before the election. It shortens the absentee ballot request window by 7 days. It cuts early voting hours by eliminating the last day of early voting, that Monday before the election, where a lot of folks have throughout the past few years have cast their ballots early on that Monday. Requires what we see as a bit of a confusing 3-tiered voter ID process for absentee ballots, which can lead to longer lines and perhaps inappropriately forcing voters to cast provisional ballots when they do those early voting opportunities and are casting those ballots. It abolishes any ability for the Secretary of State or the boards of elections to prepay return postage for absentee ballot requests and absentee ballots. We think that it should be free to vote, including the ability to cast that absentee ballot. And while there are a few provisions that in this bill that do codify a lot of what we did learn from those from the 2020 election, and the ability to actually have some of those opportunities with those drop boxes, to understand really what are the limits of the post office when it comes to getting those ballots back and forth. And now within this bill, it does allow for what we saw in the general election, the ability to get those absentee ballot applications online instead of having to go back and forth with an application, then your ballot through the mail. So there are a few things that do put into law. Some of the things that really should just be modernization. The impacts that it does have to some of the abilities for us to actually vote early and vote in a way that is safe and secure is still a bit is still jeopardized by this bill. So it is moving through the House right now. We're involved in some conversations. Our coalition of good government groups are taking the lead to make sure that our voting rights are protected with this bill. Moving on to another piece, and this is both a House bill that was on its own bad, and then when it moved to be part of the state budget bill, when it was added at the 11th hour, it was actually made a little bit worse. So House Bill 285, what it does is it provides the General Assembly the sole right to intervene into cases, lawsuits where legislation that they pass is being challenged as unconstitutional. I'll give them their due. The General Assembly does have the right to pass any bill they like, including bills that are unconstitutional. That's why we have the courts. That's why we have a law center at OEC to challenge those unconstitutional bills. This bill, however, really puts especially regular citizens who are challenging unconstitutional bills, whether they be conservation, impacts to conservation, impacts to the environment, or impacts to our democracy, the ability to go to the courts and challenge those laws as unconstitutional. That's difficult in its own, but when you're also going up against not just an agency enforcing that bill, but also the Attorney General's office, and now the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate with untold numbers of deep pockets to fund that side of litigation, it really puts and perhaps can actually silence a lot of the cases to challenge those unconstitutional laws, and it is surely not good government. But what the Senate did in their omnibus amendment was to add this bill, but also take it a step further and allow in a 11th hour modification to allow the General Assembly, essentially allow just the Speaker and the President of the Senate to intervene automatically in cases that challenge the redistricting maps that we just talked about. So if there's a redistricting map that does not follow the constitutional amendment that we had passed, that provides for true representation and gets rid of gerrymandering, this allows the power of the Speaker of the House, of the President of the Senate, to intervene automatically in those cases. Again, we think that that's an impact to especially folks that are challenging the unconstitutionality of what I mentioned is one of the most important things the General Assembly does, and does it in a way that we think really jeopardizes the Constitution and also the Constitution's separation of powers, and allowing the General Assembly really to take over a role that is in the executive to enforce those, or also in the judicial branch to determine that unconstitutionality. So there's a lot of issues impacting not just our air, land, and water, but also our democratic institutions. And I can open it up if there is any questions. I can flip to that. Let me just take a look. As I'm taking a look, if Pete or Randy, if you had any other comments on just where we are in terms of, we're almost halfway through this first year of the General Assembly, and you've laid out a lot. And what is your prognosis as we enter the summer break for the General Assembly? Where will we be when it comes winter?
A loaded question, Trent. Well, I will say, at least on the energy side of things, it's always busy at the State House, but it is really busy at the State House right now. And I, for one, am looking forward to summer break. So we'll kind of have a little bit of time to breathe. But it's going to depend on what they're able to push through, I think, on these energy bills that I was talking about earlier before they go on summer break, to know kind of what our fall into the winter is going to look like on the energy side. Because right now, Senate Bill 52, there are, I believe, 9 amendments they're taking a look at today and tomorrow. So it's really, and folks are upset on all sides of this right now, actually. So it's hard to say what that is going to shake out and whether that'll actually pass before they head home for summer break, especially with how much they're trying to get done with the budget before the end of the month as well. So hard to say, but I can't imagine we're going to have suddenly see lots and lots of exciting energy legislation. But I hope I'm surprised. So.
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball. I could probably make a lot of money predicting what happens at the State House in the future. But, for us on water, again, where we come out on this budget bill here in the next week or so is going to be key to set up further success with the H2 Ohio program in particular. And then on House Bill 175, I think deliberations with the Ohio EPA, committee members for House Agriculture and Conservation Committee will be really important and telling to see if we're going to lose foundational coverage for these ephemeral rain-dependent streams in Ohio, which would be detrimental and an unnecessary step backwards for water quality improvements. And a lot of our progress and work, I think, in the water infrastructure side as well, is going to be really tied to what happens in Washington, D.C. The American Jobs Plan is being discussed that would potentially have significant infrastructure dollars that would eventually come to the state. There's already been a number of relief packages that have come through with funding to bolster water infrastructure improvements in particular. So I think we have to keep an eye in Washington, D.C. as well to see what the next 6 months will bring.
Thanks. One of the questions that came through is will there be any public comment periods for any of these mentioned legislative measures, and can we be notified? And the answer to that is yes. And I'll let Randy and we'll let Randy and Pete maybe talk about specific bills, but one thing that's important to know is you don't always have to wait for actual testimony opportunities to arise to make sure your voice is heard. And I think what we're seeing now is just the real truth behind that, because we're getting fewer and fewer opportunities to do public testimony. Throughout the pandemic, we did not have the opportunity at the State House to do testimony virtually through measures other than going down to the State House and braving the sometimes masked, mostly maskless State House. And that wasn't just a missed opportunity, but I think some of it's kind of calculated to make sure that there are fewer opportunities. So we need to take the opportunities the same way that I think a lot of our opponents do, and that is to actually go to the legislators. And my call to all of you is to make sure you have a relationship with your state rep, with your state senator. Make sure they know who you are, what you care about, and take what you've heard today. Take a look at some of the bills, some of the analysis. There'll be if you don't get it already. There are emails out there that both the OEC and the OEC's sister organization, OEC Action Fund, send out as analysis of some of these bills. We have some action alerts, but really just pick up the phone, put it in an email, get out a pen and pad, etch yourself a letter to your rep, to your state senator, and let them know what you think of these bills, especially when they recess for the summer. They're going to hope that you forget about some of these bills. Please do not. Make sure they know that you're paying attention. We're going to make sure that on your behalf that the environmental community is paying attention to these bills, but really take the time to get that relationship with your state reps. Looking through some other questions, has the governor indicated any opposition to any of the standalone bills indicated in veto on them? I think my question earlier to Pete about 175 and the ephemeral streams, we're very confident that the governor is opposed to that, and the Ohio EPA is opposed to that. I don't know if any of the other bills, if we have any ideas about really what the governor is going to do, especially when it comes to the budget. It's a negotiation, and it's kind of like why we covered not just budget issues in here, but also standalone bills, because they're also intertwined. And a decision of the governor to veto or not veto one bill will have an impact to other bills that we have. I don't know whether Peter or Randy, you wanted to say anything on that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I would hope for House Bill 175 that deregulation of ephemeral streams, the governor would be opposed to that, given one of his marquee programs is putting money into improvements for water quality. But I think the key thing on the budget bill is going to be, given the nature of the appropriations in the bill, he will have the ability to do line item vetoes. And so I know there's a number of things that we hope might get pulled out of there if they end up in this final version. So we'll see what he acts on, but that gives him a lot of flexibility for the nuances of the bill rather than simply the whole thing up or down, yes or no. So that'll be key to see if he utilizes that unique power here next week.
Yeah, and I would just say for the energy bills, I don't anticipate any of the ones I talked about getting vetoed. However, it really depends on what the final version of Senate Bill 52 looks like. There are some folks on, like I said, on both sides of this issue that are not happy with the current version. And so depending on what gets amended into that, what happens with it, we'll see. And there also is the still possible option that some of the Senate Bill 52 actually gets shoved into the budget too. So that's something we're keeping our eyes peeled for, I know, on the budget team at OEC. And also just making sure that we're having conversations about, because some of those last minute swaps happen. And, again, depending on what that final component looks like, we'll determine whether or not there's any interest in vetoing it. But right now I'm not looking for that.
And before we cut this to an end, there is one question from Paul that just want to lift up, and although he says he doesn't know really how to ask this question, but things looking so bleak in the environment and for democratic government, how do you think this will change? And I think it goes back to a couple of things. One, it is to make sure that that voices are heard, and we will be at the State House, if not every day, it seems like every day, to make sure that that the environment is taken care of. And that our government is working for the people, and it's really on all of our efforts. So really, just contact us to if you want more information. Talk to Randy, talk to Pete, talk to Nathan. I'll answer your call, sure, and get the information so that you can also be there to make sure that your voice is heard to get the State House on the right track for once in a very long time. And the other most important thing really is protecting our environment, as you heard, is hard work. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of commitment from a lot of folks, especially a lot of folks here at OEC, not just the folks you've seen on your screen, but really everyone in our office. And you need that to fight back bad legislation. You need it to really push forward good bills. And it's thanks to donors, to many folks just like you who have joined us today, who have joined us for the past few years, who have provided the resources to us. So thank you for all of that. And I just want to just have you please consider making a donation. I think there's a link somewhere in the chat or online that you can click and help us fund these advocacy efforts. It doesn't just fund the stuff that we do at the State House. It's State House to the courthouse. It's what we do at the city halls. It's what we do in community halls. It's what we do with local groups. It's what we do with individual donors. And it really comes down to your assistance with those resources. And we thank you, and a thank you in advance for donating to keep this work happening. Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Randy, for not just being here, but really making sure that we keep the lights on and we make sure that it's clean and green energy coming behind it. Thank you, Pete, for making sure that when I get done here, because I need a drink of water, that's going to be clean and safe. And thanks to Nathan to make sure that when we go out this summer to our parks, we can enjoy those. And thank you all for joining us. And I will close it at that. Thank you, everyone.